Hey, what's up guys? Welcome back to the channel. In today's video, I'm going to be sharing a few tips on welding overhead, specifically on some 4" by 11" gauge square tubing on this particular seam. If you're new to welding and don't know much about metal, a lot of square tubing comes with the corners rounded, so therefore whenever you put square tubing together like so, a lot of times there's a gap in here, and that can sometimes be a pain to weld overhead. So that's why I chose this specific weld to share some tips, because I thought it would be the most diverse and helpful on some somewhat thin material. For those of you who may not know, my name is Austin Ross. I've been a welder for about 15 years. Here on this channel, I share tips and tricks for mostly mobile rig welders, but obviously I also just share tips about welding in general, and I just share the projects that we get into from time to time. I did want to let you know about our online store, arosswelding.com. Over there you can find several helpful resources. We also carry a few welding tools. We're constantly adding to the store, trying to get products that I use, that I believe in, that are good quality for people like you and I. You can also find links to our trade school website, arosswelding.school, if you're interested in some online courses. All right, tip number one is line of sight. Making sure you can see where you're going. Actually putting your hood down and making sure your clear lens is clean, making sure you can see where you're going with your electrode. That's a pretty big deal, seeing where you're going. As I was prepping for this video, I realized that it's probably good that people go to welding school and practice in these practice scenarios like this, or practicing in your garage like I'm doing now with this little practice setup, because from my years of experience, real world experience, it is way harder to get comfortable in this practice scenario than it is on a real world overhead situation. For example, a lot of times whenever I'm doing an overhead weld, I'm able to lay on the ground, and laying on the ground, I can get a lot more comfortable than I can right here. All that to say is, if you can get comfortable in this practice setup, most likely you can get comfortable on a real world setup. So tip number one, line of sight and getting comfortable. Tip number two is your machine settings. I'm welding with my SAE 300. I've got it set between the 120 and 150 range, and then I've got it set on 30 on the fine current, and I'm welding with a 1/8 6010. You're probably asking, okay, what amps is that? I honestly am not sure what amps. It's roughly around 70 to 80 amps. I think the range for this particular electrode is between, I think, 75 and on up to like 125, based off of a Google search that I found on Lincoln's website, I believe. So if we're using that range, I'm on the lower range, so I'm somewhat cooler. And yeah, so your settings. But my advice or my tip for settings is every welding machine is going to be slightly different. Again, prepping for this video, I was welding with my TIG 200, and it welds different than the machine on my truck. So my best advice to you as far as what amps, I recommend setting your machine to a certain something, trying to weld a little bit. Right off the bat, you'll most generally be able to tell if it's too hot or too cold. If you're blowing holes in your material, it's too hot. If it's balling up on you, that means it's probably too cool. So just welding a little bit, going to adjust your machine, welding a little bit, going to adjust your machine, getting it dialed in to you and your experience. If you're very green, I recommend welding cooler, because the cooler you weld, the slower you can weld, and the more you can comprehend, if that makes sense. So the hotter you are, the faster you're going to have to move, and the cooler you are, the slower you can move, and the more you can focus on what you're doing and actually learn something. Tip number three is think ahead. Plan your passes. Like I mentioned at the beginning of this video, I wanted to use this specific weld as our weld to share my tips in this video, because it's going to require me to put several passes. So anytime I have a gap, especially overhead, but really with anything, I've talked about this on fence, if I've got any slight gap, I normally just focus on sealing the gap, and then I focus on putting a proper pass, or either a prettier pass or a more sound pass. So it's going to be even more critical with overhead. The first thing I'm going to do, that you'll see here in a minute, is I'm going to just either drag this 1/8 6010 or maybe do a little step motion just to seal this gap. That's all I'm trying to do. Once I get it sealed off, we're going to brush it off, and then I'm going to share some of those nitty-gritty tips that you're here for, why you clicked on this video. All right, now let's dim the lights and let's take a look at this weld puddle. All right, so like I said, I'm just gonna focus on sealing this gap. You can also help yourself by cleaning the material, which I did not. Another thing I like about stick welding is it's not as critical to clean the material. Okay, got a little hole back here I need to seal up. Alright. Should be sealed off. Take me a wire brush, clean that off. Yeah, buddy. All right, now that we've got it sealed off, tip number 4, I believe I'm on, is keeping a tight arc length. What that means is the distance between the end of your electrode and the base metal itself. So keeping your rod up in, like close to the metal as possible, versus out here. Keeping it close is going to help you a bunch on overhead. And tip number 5 is, which I'll show you here in a minute, the techniques I'm talking about, but I just want to kind of explain before I started, is staying in your puddle. What I mean by that is staying in it as you're traveling versus stepping out too far. To do this, your amps have to be set right, but your travel speed, which is my next tip, what am I on, 6 or 7? Your travel speed has to match your amps, if you will. So to stay in your puddle, it can't be too hot, because if it's too hot, it's going to want to droop. So it's got to be a kind of a fine combination between those last 3 tips I just said, 4, 5, and 6, I guess it would be. A tight arc length, staying in your puddle, and travel speed. So travel speed is the speed in which you get from point A to point B. So those are the main 3 tips that I have for overhead welding. Now let's take a look through the welding lens. All right, so first we'll go from this angle so you can see what I mean by tight arc length. So I'm going to strike up right here in the middle. So see how my rod is, digging in the metal pretty much. Come down here and show you what I'm doing as far as staying in my puddle. This is what I mean by staying in my puddle versus stepping way out here. Let's see, it's starting to get a little bit warm. If it does start to get warm, you just increase your travel speed. It was getting a little warm here at the end, so I sped up, so it's a little low right here, but I hope that was helpful. I hope you were able to see what I was talking about. I encourage you to play with those 3 different variables: your arc length, your technique, as well as your travel speed, making sure your travel speed more or less matches the other 2 variables, your arc length and your technique. At the end of the day, in my opinion, there's not technically a wrong method. You kind of just have to do what works for you. As long as the end result is the same, it's all good, right? If there's one thing that I learned through my 8 years of pipeline welding, is you gotta do what works for you in that specific situation. So what you do on this overhead weld may not work, and the amps, those exact amps, may not work on the next situation, because the variables are so different from each weld to the next. The size of your material, like the length of our material here, makes a big difference. The thickness obviously makes a difference. The welding rod, different welding rods are coming out with nowadays, the way they make them. There's just so many different variables, and that's actually one of the things I enjoy about stick welding, mobile welding, and welding in general, is just the fact that it allows you to adapt to your situation. You kind of have to be someone who can adapt to your situation. There's not an exact amp and an exact method that's going to work every single time the exact same way every single time when it comes to stick welding with human hands, if that makes sense. Too many different variables, in my opinion anyway. Hope it was helpful. Hope you enjoyed the video. Don't forget to check out our website, arosswelding.com, and our trade school, arosswelding.school. Hope you have an awesome weekend, and remember, learn something every day.